of the roots of any tree are in the top foot of soil. I got it.
Oh. But some of them,
I've got
it
8
should be a
inches
hard copy. But I can, yeah,
somewhere.
well, I can
We have a half
send
inch of
some
it.
once I get.
You grow a lot of moss.
Kathy,
Contact.
we were ready to go.
A couple minutes.
Okay.
So check your box for tomatoes. I know. They're talking about expanding, I understand.
They're going to buy the
They need more. Yeah. What we could turn that into a copy, you know, cut out one that probably good. Good, that's what we want.
There's no liquor covering.
That's right, since it's all by them.
There's no spirit is minus or
Man, I wonder what they think is awesome. We can clean up.
somebody might claim the air is above.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and for today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Dale Noble with us. He is a lifetime summer Lakesider. He and his wife, Tina, continue a family tradition at Lakeside that stretches back to the 1890s. And Dr. Noble was the inaugural chair of the Lakeside Chautauqua Foundation and subsequently served 2 terms as chair of the Lakeside Association Board of Directors. Dale is a professional historian, holding degrees from Yale University and Northwestern. And for the last 15 years of his 40 years as a professor of American history at both public and private higher education institutions, he served as president of Ohio's Denison University. And today's session is titled Historic Preservation at Lakeside, History and Philosophy. And this session is supported by the Lucille and Verl Smith Endowment for Historic Preservation. Lucille and Verl operated Smith Real Estate back in the 70s and the 80s and were very active in the Lakeside community. Lucille served on the association board for several terms, and both were active in the Lakeside Methodist Church. I do ask you to please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Dr. Dale Noble.
Thanks, John. Mike, I'm on. And there is no cost to this presentation, but we did want to recognize the Smiths for their support for preservation activities at Lakeside. You can tell it's an inclement weather day, or you'd all be doing something more important. So, but we're glad to see you. In some ways we have this backwards. 2 or 3 weeks ago, Jim Schweitzer did a presentation on the mechanics of historic preservation at Lakeside, how the HPDRB works, how the process of applying for certificate of appropriateness for changes to property or new builds, how that all works. We're going backwards. This is going to be more about how we got to where we are now and what sort of the philosophical elements go into historic preservation at Lakeside. I guess I'll start by saying something I thought I'd never say. 60 or 70 years ago, when I was a boy at Lakeside, my father said, buying a cottage at Lakeside would be one of the worst financial moves anyone could ever make. Who would ever make a dime on a cottage at Lakeside? And this from a guy who came to Lakeside for the first time in the 40s as a young soldier on leave to visit his fiancée, my now mother, and her family, and then came back every year thereafter until his death 60 years later. He loved Lakeside, and he passed that love on to his children and grandchildren, but he really doubted the wisdom of investing in a lakeside cottage, and he only did so later in life when he figured he could afford the loss if he ever had to sell it. With that as a background, let's sort of start with this premise, which I think drives our understanding of historic preservation at Lakeside, and that is that historic preservation is community preservation. Preservation of the built environment of a place visibly connects a community's present and its future to its past. Preservation of structures is not just about aesthetics. It's about preserving the character of a community. It does so by preserving the scale of structures in a community, by preserving the relationship between structures in a community, about maintaining the harmony between different means of locomotion in a community, pedestrian traffic, vehicular traffic, bicycle traffic. It can preserve a community's understanding of neighborliness and how people interact with one another in that community. The protection of the Lakeside built environment began really very early in Lakeside's history. From the very beginning, as soon as private cottages were authorized in the early years of Lakeside, the Lakeside Company at the time came out with regulations as they related to sewer and water issues, other sanitary issues, came out with regulations having to do with the siting of properties, their relationship to one another, came out with regulations as it related to the scale of structures on Lakeside streets. But regulation related to historic preservation didn't come until quite a bit later. When Lakesiders finally decided that they had a history to preserve and it was under threat. Attention to historic preservation at Lakeside actually grew out of a kind of what I would call a slow rolling crisis. The decades following World War II were not initially very kind to the built environment at Lakeside. You know, just at a time when Lakeside, at the end of World War II, was heading towards its first 100 years, and when it was becoming an increasingly rare example of a Chautauqua community. Chautauqua communities, which once had numbered in the hundreds, if not the thousands, at least temporary Chautauquas, were down by the end of World War II to the dozens and would soon fall further. But I'm reminded the community I live in outside of Austin, Texas, has a Chautauqua Park. Nobody in town has an idea what Chautauqua Park has anything to do with. They assume it has something to do with New York. Well, I guess it does indirectly. It meant that there was a sort of a temporary 2-week Chautauqua every summer in that community. And you could go around the United States and find 1 week and 2 week and weekend Chautauquas all over the place. Lakeside was rare as a long-term residential Chautauqua, and even those were largely disappearing in the years after the Second World War. In fact, during the 1950s and 60s, a number of lakeside cottages, early lakeside cottages, and there were early lakeside cottages. In fact, by 1885, a dozen years after the founding, there were some 400 structures on the grounds. But in the 50s and 60s, a number of them began to disappear. They fell into disrepair. A few collapsed. Others were removed. And vacant lots began to pop up where once there had been cottages. In many cases, these were filled by, I guess what you can only describe by as unsympathetic structures. Suburban colonials, wide, low-slung brick ranch houses, campground-style A-frames, Usonian flat-roofed structures, concrete block houses, and even some public structures like the 1960s dock house of concrete block and the first iteration of what became the patio restaurant. Now, there's nothing wrong with these houses. These are pleasant and livable enough houses, and they work in many communities, but they were jarring in Lakeside by the effect that they had on their neighbors, often out of scale with those neighbors, and they had the effect of walling people in rather than connecting house to street. In a community where the front porch had been critical to connecting people in their cottages to those walking by, many of these modern structures had no connecting link like that as part of their basic form. During these years, there was, as you know, many of you know, there was even talk about taking down the venerable Hotel Lakeside, which had suffered from years of neglect, and replacing it with a modern, quote-unquote, motor court. The bandstand in Bettinger Park, Central Park, had fallen into disrepair. I remember in the 50s playing under its rotting base before it finally was renewed. Epworth Lodge, which was originally a youth dining hall and center for youth activities, was all but abandoned after the Wesley Lodge was built in the 1960s. Even cottages that were venerable began to suffer from unsympathetic giganticism, as people found ways to add and add and add to the point where some began to overwhelm their neighbors and disrupted previously harmonious streetscapes. Front porches disappeared to allow for increased interior space, especially after the advent of air conditioning, which made it possible to bring air conditioning into those previous porch spaces, which again altered the atmosphere of connection between passerby and residents. Consequently, in the 50s and 60s, and on into the 70s, on into the early 80s, property values stagnated and even dramatically fell. In 1972, I know from family experience, in 1972, a sound Ross triplex cottage, you know, the square, I'll show one later, the American four-square Ross cottages. There are a few that are oversized. One of those sold with 8 bedrooms and 3 baths and 3 kitchens for under $15,000. In the early 1980s, a well-maintained lakefront cottage was on the market for $85,000, and people thought it was way too much, and it languished on the market. At the same time, a solid 1920s craftsman-style cottage with a new kitchen and a new master suite on 2 lots with a detached garage sold for $65,000. No one, particularly my father, expected to make any money from buying and subsequently selling a cottage. And in fact, people who were aging out of cottages or had cottages that no longer met family needs were finding it impossible to sell. It created quite a crisis among retired Methodist preachers, many of whom had bought these cottages as part of their retirement plan with the notion that they would sell those, and they weren't bringing much. So finding the historical and aesthetic and cultural and even economic viability of Lakeside beginning to show signs of leakage, the Lakeside Association Board engaged a consultant in the early 1980s and conducted a historic resources survey, surveyed all of the surviving structures, both public and private in Lakeside. The study found that there were 758 structures inside the fence line that were built before 1975, but the vast majority of them were built before World War II, and a remarkable proportion were built before 1900, despite the teardowns. That led to an application to the state of Ohio asking the state to nominate a Lakeside Historic District to the National Register of Historic Places. At the time, the boundaries of Lakeside followed the old railroad right-of-way, so it would exclude what? It would exclude Oak Street north of 7th. It would exclude Plum and Cherry north of 6th. It would exclude Elm from about halfway up the block of between 5th and 6th. And it would exclude Poplar from 5th to the north. But anything to the north of that, to the south, anything north of that would be within the intended bounds of a Lakeside Historic District. The National Register was still relatively new. It had been founded by Congress in 1966 to recognize, and I'm going to read this, national significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture that is present in districts, sites, buildings, and objects that possess integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, and that are associated with the lives of persons significant in our past, or that embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that have yielded, well, this is a long sentence, or yield or may be likely to yield in the future important facts to history. It was a laborious process to get Lakeside on the National Register, it first had to be recommended after a survey by Lakeside, had to be recommended to the Ohio Historic Site Preservation Advisory Board. If it passed muster there, it had to be recommended to another board that was appointed by the governor of the state, which was then James Rhodes, Republican. And then it had to be accepted by the Department of the Interior at the federal level. On March the 29th, 1983, when the Lakeside Historic District was published as being part of the National Register of Historic Places, it was one of just a handful of historic districts in the state of Ohio. German Village, I think, had been identified. The Tremont District in Cleveland had been identified. There were just a handful of districts in the entire state. That listing didn't bring lots of tangible benefits. That is, it didn't bring really specific, didn't bring money, didn't bring on its own eligibility for grants, nor did it bring particular constraints on what people did with their properties, but what it did bring was attention. It brought attention to the fact that Lakeside had a great deal of historic fabric left to preserve and that it was under threat. Since the survey and the register recognition were driven by concerns about property values, that's what really drove the Lakeside Association initially to do the survey and make the nomination, it seemed appropriate that the LPOA, the Lakeside Property Owners Association, helped by the Heritage Society, which itself was relatively new, being founded in 1968, the LPOA was the first body that took on the task of trying to encourage property owners to preserve their historic cottages, especially those that were deemed contributors to the National Register Historic District. By the nature of the LPOA, all they could do was exactly that, encourage, publicize, encourage, provide resources in some cases. The contributors are familiar to many of you. They were recently, they were identified thrice actually. They were identified in the original survey that led to the National Register nomination. In 1993, the board of Lakeside hired the Cleveland architectural firm of Gade Cern to come up with a series of guidelines that might be applied. And then, in 2021, the board authorized a modern survey of historic architecture in Lakeside and did a complete inventory, which resulted in, if I can make this move, maps like this, which identify by color code all of the different architectural types among historic contributing structures in Lakeside. This is available to us now, and each individual structure marked by a pin on here has a file, an electronic file associated with it, which has pictures and information taken from the tax rolls. We'd like this to be available to Lakesiders. We've run into a little bit of a snag recently. The vendor who undergirded this process has gone out of business, the electronics vendor, data vendor. And so until we can find a new vendor or a conversion process, it's temporarily unavailable. Have we got that now? Kathy Venema is putting her thumb in the air. We've got that figured out. So it's a really valuable resource. You know what many of those most historic types of lakeside cottages are, but just to remind of a few, the earliest cottages, this one 12 feet wide on Walnut, is a traditional board tent, basically on the footprint of a platform tent, a canvas structure built on a wooden platform, and then to have wooden walls put up in the same configuration. And eventually, sometimes one story, and like this, oftentimes two. The camp meeting style cottage, which were inspired by the cottages in Martha's Vineyard, Ocean Grove, New Jersey, Ocean Park, New Jersey, Ocean Grove, Maine, some of the eastern Chautauquas. by as early as the end of the 1870s and beginning of the 1880s, the so-called Lakeside style cottage had emerged as a distinctive type, which appeared in other Chautauquas too, but seems to have had its origin at Lakeside, a central protruding sitting room on the first floor, a bedroom on the second floor, with side entrances and side porches on either side. There are a number of these in Lakeside, and there's a variant that only has the side porch on one side. The stick style, if I can go backwards, represented in several cottages. Probably the best example is in Bradley Temple, though. The stick name being associated with the trim, essentially. Wide wooden trim on the borders, decorative wooden trim around the windows and above. You'll see it in some cottages, although it was hard to maintain. It has disappeared from many cottages. As Lakeside became more affluent, people began to display their ability to decorate their houses. You look at the bones of this, of Showboat, which we all know on 2nd Street. The bones of it are a Lakeside cottage, but it's got Gothic details, and even some Eastlake Victorian, what you'd call it, tracery on the top, the fine scrollwork. Or its neighbor, a Second Empire structure, really drawing its inspiration from urban and suburban villas. If you think I'm having trouble with this pointer, you're right, I am. Or cottages with Italianate details. There are a number at Lakeside. This is obviously Rockledge is the most familiar with its Italianate tower and eyebrow windows. The early 20th century brought some other types. This is a Ross cottage, which is basically an American foursquare, which you can find in communities across the land. Mr. Ross, as I think many people know, was the school superintendent in Fremont, Ohio. He built a dozen or 18 cottages around the grounds for rental. Most of them were this configuration. They're often identified. They have if they don't face the lake, they have an angled window on the porch that faces the lake. There are other American foursquares that are not Ross cottages. There was some colonial revival structures in Lakeside. This gambrel roof, Dutch colonial. There are several on the grounds. Again, a popular kind of suburban style at the time in the early 20th century. Craftsman style, characterized by 1.5 stories, relatively low-pitched roof, wide eaves. This one happens to be a Montgomery Ward catalog home. I know we're familiar with some of the Sears catalog home, but Montgomery Ward was a big competitor, and many of this type in Lakeside came as kits from Montgomery Ward. Vernacular, which simply means just sort of fits the community, fits the time and the place. This is a cottage that was loosely based upon a board tent design. It's an early 20th century cottage. Probably no architect involved at all. It was just a builder who observed the nature of the size of the lot, the nature of other cottages on the grounds, and invented. We see a lot of cottages like this. And the bungalow style, a bungalow style that was adopted from the British experience in India, where houses were built that, again, low-slung roof, large verandas. This is a well-known one on 4th Street. By 1993, I'm going backward a little bit here, it was clear that the LPOA was not really sufficient to provide guidance or assistance or regulation of preservation activities at Lakeside. And so the board, drawing upon that Gade-CERN study that I showed a little bit ago, developed preservation standards and a review process for renovation, expansion, and new builds. And those were added to the rules and regulations of Lakeside. You've seen those. They're in the back of the property owner's annual directory. And they've recently been updated in 2023 and reorganized in a way to try to make them more user-friendly and to harmonize them with other Lakeside regulations. In 1994, after a set of regulations was placed into the rules, a Historic Preservation and Design Review Board was appointed for the first time, and it's been operating then for the last 30 years. The current membership, I'm trying to look whether any current members are here right now. Any of our HPDRB members here? I don't think so. They've heard all this before. They've participated in this before. It's fairly typical of the membership over the years. It includes Dan Bucky. Many of you know Dan, who has built, moved, renovated, sold, rented out numerous cottages on the grounds. Rose Dostal, who is a newer Lakesider, who is a registered architect and has an interior design building in Hudson, Ohio, and is a property owner. Lindsay Jones, who some of you have heard speak, who is the owner of Blind Eye Restoration, a historic preservation restoration architectural firm, a construction firm in the German Village area of Columbus. Charlie Meyer from Napoleon, Ohio, who taught secondary school construction sciences. We have an advisory member that is a non-voting member, but who may have the opportunity to come onto the board once a vacancy occurred, Chuck Baker, who's in building construction and development in the Youngstown area. And my background is a historian and having presided over a couple of colleges that are both National Register Historic Districts, and I did this work for a Texas city some years ago for a number of years. So all bring some experiences to the role of volunteer that we hope is useful. We're always looking for new volunteers. So if you have an interest in historic preservation, we'd like to hear your name. The goals of the regulations that Lakeside now have undergone, as I said, refinement since they first appeared in 1993, most recently in 2023. But they all have the same purpose, to preserve not just the aesthetics, but the character of Lakeside. The goal is to attach Lakeside visibly to its past in a way that offers an education for visitors to Lakeside and a reminder for property owners and renters. The built environment, after all, tells the developmental story of Lakeside. You can see it in wood and stone on the grounds. You can see in the structures the camp meeting phase, which was the first phase of Lakeside. As cottages get a little more elaborate and numerous, you see the Sunday school and encampment phase of the late 1980s, or 1880s, 1890s. The Chautauqua movement phase, beginning really in the 80s but accelerating in the 90s, the university for every man, as Chautauqua called itself. The prolonged era in the early 20th century of youth camps and women's missionary organizations that met on the grounds. And then after the opening of the Sandusky Bay Bridge in 1929, the growth of Lakeside as a family resort community, all setting the stage for the modern Lakeside in its 4 pillars of Chautauqua. That built environment conveys a sense of place and a sense of connection to that past. Among the rules are those that encourage a walkable, face-to-face community, livability, and our particular community values. They encourage, as I've said earlier, a front porch community, which connects people inside to the outside. It encourages our Lakeside version of neighborliness. Our rules consider streetscapes rather than individual properties in isolation. Our rules try to preserve sustainability by encouraging reuse of original materials rather than replacement. Every time a siding is pulled off a cottage, original siding, it goes into a landfill somewhere and fills it up. And then it's replaced by new materials, which require carbon inputs, transportation. When you think about it, our older structures have a kind of embodied energy in them. And to release that energy requires it be replaced. One of the things the board is very much interested in is seeking authenticity as opposed to reproduction lakeside-ishness. In operation, we try to take the view that we're consultants to property owners, helping them live within the regulations while achieving their goals for the livability of their cottage. We attempt to get people to read and understand the rules early on before any renovation or expansion project has begun. One of the things we've learned in operation is that once an individual has spent a lot of money to hire an architect or a builder and develop a set of building plans, they become married to their plans. And any question of those plans tends to be a wrenching personal and emotional experience for them. So what we've tried to do in recent years is to get people to come to us, working through our Lakeside Development Administrator, Jim Schweitzer, and Lisa Hogue, who's our support person at the front desk of the association offices, to share with us early on their goals, where we can help them think about how they can achieve those goals within the preservation regulations of Lakeside. We can steer property owners to successful projects. The greatest interest we have is probably, as I think I've already said, is in street facade. The part that people see. We're probably more generous in what happens behind the street, the back of the lot. Interior arrangements are property owners' own business, though the board, based upon their experience, can sometimes make what we hope are helpful suggestions about layout. One of the principles we try to apply is don't disadvantage your neighbors. Don't plan a renovation that places your air conditioning unit right outside your neighbor's bedroom window. People do that. We try to encourage original materials or those that closely mimic original materials. There are a lot of new products. Some are cement-based, some are cellular products that mimic the nature of wood but don't require all the paintings. The Lakeside rules now directly prohibit most forms of vinyl siding. There are a few kinds of vinyl shingles which are of higher gauge and better quality that sometimes pass muster, but those have now been eliminated by the rules. We try to make distinctions to some extent about what's happening inside the historic district to what is outside the historic district. So we've moved the fence. The fence now essentially is at the 7th Street level all across Lakeside and even goes up around the upper part of Jasmine and the upper part of Oak. We can be more generous with what happens outside the historic district where more structures are non-contributing. We attempt to discourage demolitions, though reluctantly, rarely, we sometimes have approved them, particularly when a structure seems no longer able to stand on its own. Now, here's the truth. Any structure can be saved. The question becomes at what cost? And the rule we've tried to apply is some form of reasonability, though we do our utmost to discourage demolitions, and there haven't been many around the grounds. And in a few cases, the HPDRB over the years has been overturned by the board of Lakeside. We encourage preservation by an annual preservation awards process, and in fact, at this upcoming LPOA meeting, we'll be making preservation awards in the area of renovation and new construction, in landscaping and hardscaping, in preservation with original materials. Our touchstone is after a cottage has been renovated in some way, does it still look like itself? If somebody came by the cottage prior to renovation and they came back a year later after renovation was done, would they say, yeah, I recognize that cottage. I know that cottage anywhere. If they come back and say, gee, that looks like a whole new cottage, I don't remember that at all, we failed. And so we try to apply that principle. We're responsible for Lakeside public buildings as well, and in fact, we've tried to hold Lakeside itself to account because that sets an example for private property owners. We called for and got boards to hire consultants in 2021 to do that new survey that I described, which we hope is an advantage to property owners. We have better data about Lakeside Cottage. We have better identification of architectural types and some better understanding of when they were built. About that same time, in the early 20s, we worked with Danbury Township to streamline how Danbury zoning and Lakeside rules work together. So Danbury will not issue a building permit unless they have a certificate of appropriateness that's been awarded by Lakeside, by the HPDRB process. Since the beginning of its work in 1994, the HPDRB, which has included many volunteer Lakesiders over that time period, has received approximately 1,300 applications for certificates of appropriateness, and almost 350 of those just since 2018. Since there are only about 900 structures on the grounds, it indicates that some individual properties have had 2 and even 3 changes come to them in that time period. But it also suggests that in that time, probably a majority of all Lakeside cottages have undergone some kind of renovation, major repair, restoration process. What we have is a remarkable collection of buildings that have survived, helping ensure, I think, that we're not just another resort by the side of the lake. I think the question we all ask as we come back, those of us who come back in the summertime, say, does Lakeside still look like Lakeside? More important than does it look like Lakeside, does it feel like Lakeside? Does it function like Lakeside? Does the built environment promote Lakeside values? These are questions that we ask ourselves in the HPDRB, and I think that all Lakesiders need to ask themselves as we go forward for the next 150 years of Lakeside. Let me stop there and take questions. Cindy.
I'll be right there with the mic, okay? Can you hang?
Thanks.
So when you talk about contributing structures, this is something I've always wondered. Is it every structure within the area that was defined in 1983, or is it only certain structures?
Only certain structures.
And is there a list somewhere of which structures are considered contributing?
Yeah, if we went back to that map with the little dots,
Yeah.
all of those were contributing structures.
So everything in the Ruskin survey that has a dot is a contributing structure,
Yes.
and if it doesn't have a dot, it's not a contributing structure.
It has a, Jim, should I go back? Go back. There. All of those are, Jim, what's not recorded?
Those are all the cottages in Lakeside and their styles. So there should be about 924 up on that if you add up the numbers on the right. The map you're referring to, you could probably pull up online. It's in the 1982 application. Not to confuse you, it was awarded in 1983. We applied in 82. There's a map in there that has 4 categories: contributor, contributor with alterations, non-contributor, and commercial or some other designation.
The original National Register nomination said there were cottages in 3 age ranges. The first was 1873 to 1899, or 1875 to 1899. The second one was 1900 to 1925, and the third was 1925 to 1950. So there's nothing after, basically nothing after the Second World War that's considered a contributing structure. Yeah.
It's online. It's online? Or under the HPDRB site. Communities.
Yeah, go ahead.
Has there been any inventory done about how many Montgomery Ward, J.C. Penney, and the Sears homes are in Lakeside?
I don't know of any. Kathy, has anything been done by the Heritage Society in that regard? Not that I know of. It'd be an interesting research project. It'd be a little bit tricky to do. There are some that look like they're kit homes, but they're not kit homes because they were kind of a standard style. But you could probably figure out fairly closely which ones were.
There's at least one Sears.
Yeah. We know of the one Sears for sure on 5th or 6th, yeah. That's the Stevens property. But I know there are more as well. If you go to either go to the historic Sears or Montgomery Ward catalogs, and this was popular particularly in the 1920s and 30s, you will suddenly think you've been transported to Lakeside because you'll recognize so many of the styles that are there. I mean, they have big two-story colonials too, but a lot of them are these sort of craftsman style.
Our house was an Aladdin home.
Yes.
It was built in 1936.
Right.
We got all the paperwork and everything. $1,000 is what the bill of sale was.
Yeah.
Came in on the railroad.
Yeah.
That's how they did it.
Yeah. I mean, they're not what we think of modern prefabs. They didn't come with pre-manufactured walls, or they were big stacks of lumber, essentially, with instructions. Pre-cut to length. Yeah. Yeah. But there were other manufacturers. You're right. Aladdin was a big one, and there are probably more. That's what would make it hard. You'd have to figure out who all the manufacturers at the time were that were doing distribution in this part. And the fear was that it would be a temporary solution. The reproduction doors are not which I understand is one of the things that they are looking at. As they do a facilities master plan, it would be appropriate for them to ask of the...
But contributing with alterations, and then the next one below that,
I can't read it.
it gets,
I think Frank Baker had a